Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to discuss the 380 ACP cartridge. I want to discuss some of its history, go over some of its technical data, turn that into contextual data, and then do a little bit of comparison before it's all said and done. With that, why don't we go ahead and roll into history. The 380 ACP was developed in 1908 by John Moses Browning for his Colt pocket hammerless. He would actually take a look at his previous design, the 38 ACP, and downsize it to the 380. The 38 ACP had been developed for military contracts. However, having just come out of conflict in the Philippines where the 38 Smith & Wesson had not performed that well, the United States Army was not looking at the 38 ACP. Now taking a look at pocket type designs, John Moses Browning, or JMB as will be referred to, decided that the 38 ACP would be too large for this requirement and would instead go after the 380. Now, 380 in this case was actually a really savvy choice because the pocket hammerless was a blowback design. Now, what does blowback mean in this case? Blowback means that there's no actual locking surfaces within the semi-automatic handgun, that the breech is held closed by both the weight of the slide and the power of the spring. That way, actual unlocking occurs after pressures drop down to a safe level so that you don't have either a swelled cartridge casing causing some type of malfunction or an out-of-battery detonation, something along those lines. The issue with blowback designs is that with all things, we are slaves to physics. So the larger the cartridge that you chamber in that blowback design, the heavier the slide, the stronger the spring has to be, all that kind of stuff. A great example of this would be high point firearms. They make high points all the way up into 45 ACP, and they're massive because you have to deal with these large pressures and cartridges and all that kind of stuff. Equal and opposite reaction, Newtonian physics, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that's good. Oh, that's good. That is my absolute favorite bottle there. Anyway, the 380 became a really great trade-off between power and size in this case. There were plenty of other blowback designs out of the market. We're talking about very early handgun design to begin with. There was a lot of research and effort being put into semi-automatic handguns. Blowbacks were being researched quite heavily. However, a lot of those were very small caliber pistols. Not necessarily what you want if you're looking for an actual credible defensive option, but you still want something that's portable, concealable, fits in a vest pocket, something along those lines. So the 380 became very interesting for that purpose. Now, the 380 would also wind up seeing popularity in other places. In Europe, the 380 would be very popular as both a military and police cartridge up into the 80s and 90s. A surprising period of time that 380 would remain relevant in those European circles. And of course have some interest on the private market as well. In America, the 380 has always been kind of relegated to a backup gun. A pocket pistol, something very small, concealable, but not necessarily a cartridge that you wanted in a fighting handgun of some sort, for reasons that we'll discuss here after a bit. Now, in recent times, there has been a resurgence of popularity in micro-sized pistols for carry, specifically with the advent of the SIG P365, which is a very small 9mm handgun that manages to pack 10 rounds of 9mm. That's very interesting. That same technology, that same magazine technology has now been applied to the 380 to where you can get very high capacity micro-compact 380 pistols out on the market. You're not just stuck with things like the LCP or the LCP2, Colt Mustangs, things along those lines, which are very small handguns that can be very difficult to shoot well, making them really only good for either bad breath distance engagements or just laying down covering fire while you extricate yourself from whatever particular situation. The place where the 380 has probably had the most popularity is actually South America. A lot of these South American countries have laws in place regulating the ability for private citizens to be able to own cartridges or firearms that chamber cartridges that are utilized by the military or the police, making the 380 a very popular option down south for those who are legal to be able to own firearms or localities that you can own firearms in South America. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the history portion Why don't we go ahead and hop into the technical specifications, starting off with a little bit of size association. So on the left is the 22 long rifle, in the middle is the 380 ACP, and on the right is the 25 ACP. This is a selection of cartridges that are popular for use in blowback operated firearms. Now, the 380 is known by quite a few different designations. In this video, thus far, we've referred to it as the ACP, or automatic Colt pistol. It has also been referred to as the just almost switched into 32 ACP, which if you're interested in that, I did a video on the 32 a little while back, link in the description. It has also been referred to as 9mm Browning, 9mm Corto and Kurtz, both meaning short, as well as 9x17, which is a reference to the dimensions of the bullet itself, or the dimensions of the cartridge, and that being a 9mm projectile seated on a 17mm long casing. The projectile can be found in FMJ, hard cast, hollow points, ballistic tips, all that kind of stuff. Generally ranging from grainages from 88 grains to about 105. Velocities going somewhere between 900 feet per second and as high as 1200 feet per second in a plus P type loading. The cartridge casing is slightly tapered, rimless, with a center fire primer. All right, so from here, why don't we go ahead and get into the contextual type aspects of this discussion thus far. Because most people will tell you that the 380 is incredibly anemic. And I conditionally agree. A lot of the issues that people take up with 380 actually kind of stems from a bygone era. When you talk about the lifespan of the 380 from 1908 to today, there's been quite a bit of change to that cartridge, just like there has been with 9mm that has a similar lifespan. However, still, most firearms practitioners will tell you that they will not carry or defend themselves with anything below a 9mm. Why is that? Well, a lot of this comes down to bullet construction. For a very long time, you were pretty much stuck with FMJs when it came to 380 if you wanted a cartridge that both chambered and fed reliably, let alone penetrated deep enough. And this is where we run into some interesting problems with the 380. I have known quite a few 380 handguns that have not liked hollow points. I remember when I was growing up, my dad had a Bursa 380, and we found that it consistently choked on 380 hollow point ammunition. It's actually one of the reasons that he wound up getting rid of it. The issue, especially when you're talking about the pre-2000s landscape of cartridge and bullet design, is that if you had a 380, or many times a bullet in general, with a wide enough mouth to be able to expand reliably, it might hang up in feeding. Whereas if you had a opening small enough on a hollow point to give you reliable feeding, it may not necessarily expand reliably, which means that you're just getting that little tiny 9mm projectile pushing through, which if you're not going to get expansion and you don't necessarily have velocity, because the 380 is not a super fast cartridge, you're not really getting the best of either world. You're not destroying that much tissue or anything along those lines. It's going to take multiple shots to be able to put a threat down. Multiple shots, this is where your target placement crowd comes in and all that kind of stuff, which, in general, guys, we're talking about handgun cartridges. Handguns are not good fight stoppers. They are convenient fight stoppers because you're more likely to have a handgun on you should the fight arise. However, I would sooner fight with a rifle and rifle cartridge pretty much any chance that I get. The 380 is not inhibited by this no differently than a 9mm 40 or 45 is. Everything comes down to shot placement. Everything comes down to being able to put reliable, repeatable hits onto a target. Now, the FBI wound up doing a bunch of research into cartridge development and have developed their own testing protocols for duty type cartridges. And this, according to them, you need 12 to 18 inches of penetration with 1.5 times expansion in order to be able to have an effective fight-stopping cartridge, with a preference going towards the 18-inch end of the spectrum. And this testing is done through ballistics gelatin, which if you're a long-time viewer of the channel and you've seen a bunch of these cartridge discussion videos before, go ahead and check the description. I'll have it linked to where this video picks back up so you don't have to re-listen to the same thing being rehashed yet again. The testing protocol involves ballistic gelatin, which is calibrated to be able to take into account all of the different things that you encounter in the body. So that being flesh, fat, muscle, air and fluid-filled organs of the body, all that kind of stuff. It is calibrated to take into account all of those things. They shoot through 4 layers of denim in order to be able to see if the cavity for the projectile will choke up and not allow it to expand reliably. Now, further extrapolating off of this discussion when it comes to ballistics or FBI ballistics testing, which kind of more or less establishes our expectations for what pistol cartridges are going to do. Whenever I'm looking at cartridges, handgun cartridges specifically, I wind up looking at LuckyGunner.com because Lucky Gunner has been building a comprehensive body of work over the last 7 years at least, taking into account a ton of different calibers and loads for those calibers, testing based off of FBI expectations and ballistic testing protocols. All of them. Doing 5-shot strings, being able to show the expansion of the bullets, consistency, average of penetration distance, all that kind of stuff. Now, if you look in that cartridge chart, 380, which is actually one of the original chamberings that was covered by that catalog, I guess you could say, 380, 9mm, 40, and 45 were the original entries in it. Now it's expanded well beyond that. There is a 380 chart. And if you look through that, there's an awful lot of options that either overpenetrate or do not reliably expand. There are at least 2 options that do both. However, they are at the minimum side of expansion. That's one of the key things here, is that it is not a one-to-one comparison between ballistic gelatin and the human body when it comes to penetration. Because you're taking into account all of the calibration for all of these different things that go on inside of the human body, it is not a one-for-one. If you get 18 inches in ballistic gelatin, you will get 18 inches in the human body. It doesn't work that way. You could get more, you could get less. It all depends on what it is that you pass through. You punch through somebody's chest, through their ribs and stuff like that, that is going to impact the penetration distance and all that kind of stuff of that projectile. So with that being the case, with the ballistics charts there of this very wide body of information showing that there's not that many loads that are effective, I can understand why somebody may not necessarily default to choosing the 380 as a defensive cartridge, or even being able to recommend the 380 as a defensive cartridge. However, loads do exist. Now the only question becomes availability. Can you get a hold of effective defensive ammunition for your purposes? Which is still way better than prior to the 2000s, when you really would not have even had this expectation. You pretty much might as well just be shooting FMJs at that point, just so you get the penetration in the human body. No expansion, but at least you're poking things that matter. That is our kind of contextual side of things. Why don't we go ahead and get into the comparison portion for this. Now, we've already kind of done some comparison there with 9mm. Of course, the 9mm is clocking in at easily 1,200 feet per second, if not higher. You have a 115 grain projectile mostly, but 124s are very common. You can get all the way up to 147s and as low as 88 grains. You've got a lot of options in the 9mm that are fantastic expanders. You can find the ammunition relatively cheap to be able to train with. There's a lot of really positive things about the 9mm. In no way am I putting the 380 ahead of the 9mm in this case. So much so that I don't even think it's worthwhile to compare the two. The 38 ACP is, well, extinct, but it had similar ballistics to kind of the light end of 9mm. We're talking 115 grain projectiles, moving at roughly 1150, something along those lines. Obviously, had it had any staying power in the market, it would have had more projectile offerings available for it. And perhaps it could have eclipsed the 380 ACP, but of course it fell back into anonymity. And that actually kind of establishes a portion of this conversation that I want to have now with what I did wind up selecting against. Because when we're talking about early semi-automatic pistol development, we see a ton of different cartridges come out. All kinds of weird stuff, 9mm Largo and 8mm Nambu and so on and so forth. Quite a few different cartridges. The 380 has outlasted the vast majority of them. So in this case, I thought it would be interesting to compare the cartridge to the 9mm Glicenti. Now, for those of you who don't know, the 9mm Glicenti was developed by the Italians just prior to World War I, and it was meant to be fired in a blowback-operated handgun, which is commonly referred to as being one of the worst handgun designs ever encountered. Now, the 9mm Glicenti seems to be very similar to a 9mm Luger in overall dimensions, and that is because it is. However, the 9mm Glisenti was a little more downloaded in order to be able to produce a lighter blowback operated 9mm handgun. The design was a truncated flat-tipped bullet moving at between 1050 and 1070 feet per second, and like 116 to 124 grain, if I remember correctly. I'll annotate down below if I got that wrong. When it comes to energy, these two cartridges, if you take a look at the wide variety of 380 available out on the market, are generating very similar energy at about 300 foot-pounds-ish, maybe a little bit lower. However, when we talk about it in the modern sense, the 380 has more load options available. That truncated, flat-tipped projectile is definitely not what would be considered a favorable defensive cartridge here today, and really all interest in the cartridge pretty much dropped out fairly early on. Like by the 1920s, you wouldn't see a lot of interest in this cartridge. There have been some new batches of ammunition made for what few guns still exist in the world, but you want to talk about staying power, this doesn't have it. And that's the same case for a lot of other cartridges designed in the same time period, yet the 380 has outlasted them all and has made it long enough to be able to get the advantage of this new cartridge design and all that kind of stuff, and to be able to remain semi-relevant in the wild today, unlike the 9mm Glisenti or 9mm Largo or 7.63 Mauser or a lot of these other even military cartridges that saw faithful service in World War I and World War II. The 380 has surpassed them all. It's kind of interesting when you look at it that way. And I think a lot of it comes down to it's a light recoiling cartridge that you can fit into very small handguns and still have efficacy. More so than a 32 ACP, more so than a 25 auto, so on and so forth. You can actually get good ballistics out of it, whereas with a lot of these other cartridges, you're better off shooting solids, FMJs, hardcast, whatever, and just poking holes in things that matter. Whereas the 380 can actually get that good expansion with the right loads. All right, that's our comparison portion. What are my recommendations when it comes to this cartridge? Would I recommend this as a duty type cartridge? Today, absolutely not. With the relative lack of good loads available and the cost of the ammunition being higher than that of 9mm, being closer to that of 40 Smith & Wesson, if not exceeding it in some places, I would not necessarily recommend that as a duty option. I would sooner see a duty chambering not go below 9mm. Okay, well, you specify duty. What about for self-defense, home defense? In that case, I think the 380 is a acceptable option. I consider 380 to be my minimal option, whereas 32 ACP is on the wrong side of minimal, in my opinion. And that is because I can still find loads that expand, even if I don't have a wide variety of them. Which might mean that I'm not necessarily right off the bat recommending that people get 380s, as much as if they were looking at one, I would caution them to be very careful about the ammunition that they selected for use. Now that's primarily in a self-defense type situation. What about home defense? With a few exceptions, I would not recommend a 380 in home defense, and that's nothing to do with the cartridge. That is everything to do with the handguns available in it. I would not recommend that your bedside gun be a Ruger LCP2. But I might be okay with the idea of you running a Beretta Model 80X. Because at the very least, you can put lights and stuff like that on that handgun. Still not necessarily my first recommendation, but I would not fault you for choosing to do so. Well, what about as a hunting cartridge? Absolutely not. However, in Europe, it is legal, but that is primarily for the use in dispatching injured game. Not necessarily as like, I'm going to go out and hunt with my Walther PPK today. That's not how that plays into hunting use when it comes to Europe. Okay, well, what about competition use? Again, coming back to platform, I would not recommend it. The cartridge itself is probably perfectly acceptable for the distances that are engaged in most competitions. However, the cost of ammunition in order to be able to have a healthy training regimen and all that kind of stuff, you're better off looking at 9mm or a lot of those other cartridges. If you're trying to make power factor or something along those lines, 40 Smith & Wesson 45 would be more worth your effort. Some competitions do allow for the use of 380, pocket-sized handguns. IEPA does have a backup gun division for semi-autos and revolvers. But I don't necessarily consider that you trying to be competitive as much as you just trying to be proficient and maybe challenge yourself a little bit with your backup gun to make sure that you're getting good reps in so that you don't have a false sense of security should you ever have to employ it. All right, those are my recommendations when it comes to the 380. What do I use the 380 for? What are my experiences with the 380? Well, I grew up with the 380. I shot the Bursa and Colt Mustangs and many other 380 caliber handguns as I was growing up. And honestly, 380 has been a carry option for me from time to time. I've carried a Glock 42, which I still consider to be the absolute best 380 on the market, especially when you're talking about a concealed carry gun. And I've also carried my Browning BDA 380, previously reviewed on the channel, link in the description. So for me, the 380 has been a consistent option for me, especially when it comes to deep concealed carry. I 100% advocate for the 380 and the Glock 42 specifically. When it comes to like LCPs or LCP2s, the Kel-Tec P3ATs, not a big fan of those handguns. Not at all. They're kind of at the wrong end of the spectrum for me when it comes to the 380 because they are small handguns with terribly tiny sights that are absolutely miserable to shoot with. Whereas the Glock 42 has fantastic sights, has provisions to be able to put better sights on it. The stock sights, I mean, they're stock Glock sights. They're not that great to begin with. And if you're interested in the Glock 42, by the way, I have a review on that. Link in the description. But you can put nicer Glock-style sights into it as well as it handles recoil better. So overall, there are some really great applications for the 380, especially when you're talking about a deep concealment gun, as long as you're very specific about what handgun you use and very realistic about it, what distances you can engage with it, as well as what ammunition you're using to be able to conduct that engagement. So when you take that discussion, you look at how many caveats I threw in there for what you have to do in order for this to be successful, you can see why I may not necessarily default to offering this as what somebody should get for their defensive handgun or their first handgun or anything along those lines. There are good options available. You just have to be very careful. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.